The Ungovernable, a return to barbarian logic, by the counterintuitive. As I say, it's not just me. The loss of faith across the West in our institutions, leaders, administration, and representatives in recent years has been radical and ever more frequent. Paul Kingsnorth, Unheard. The author should have included the entire governed expanse of the world, a global sentiment as the loss of faith. Yet, that is a matter of extending the story forward, combining the ungovernable with the loss of faith. The last 5,000 years of civilization, varying enclosures of land and sea, as an outcome of violent expansion, as well as collapse, of many empires, kingdoms, and states is well recorded in history. Yet globally speaking, the people who manage to evade such enclosures or everlasting dominion can be understood as the non-state peoples. The tribal, the indigenous, the foragers and scavengers, the raiders and the non-sedentary were labeled as barbarians and savage, a counterpart of the civilized and what James C. Scott refers to as the dark twin of civilization, both in reality and semiotically. Like a tenacious combo, the civilized and the barbarian were born together as twins. A relationship that has survived to this date, most often framed within a devious logic, impositions and myths lasting thousands of years, as the superiority of the civilized versus inferiority of the uncivilized. A great disservice as baseless demonization, when modern educated people label their enemies as barbarians, or modern acts of genocide, holocaust, war and invasion as barbaric. Ingrained within us all is an unfounded fear and cultural loathing of uncivilized people, based on mythology, religion, past imaginaries, and present norms of othering. The civilized conjures up its diametrically opposite partner as the uncivilized. Worse, despite abundant historical and archaeological evidence to the contrary, the peoples who have identified themselves as belonging to the ostensibly more evolved member of each pair. It is the civilized who have taken their identity as essential, permanent, and superior. Within such a binary, there is very little difference of outlook between the ancient Chinese or Europeans or Indians, between the Ottomans or the Spanish or the British. A form of othering that has survived, right down to our age of nations and their so-called sovereignty. Owen Lattimore has articulated this dark twin conundrum most clearly. By introducing the barbarian into history and historical context, creates not only problems of legitimacy of the so-called civilized, but also the entire basis of enclosure, dominion, sovereignty, existing law, regulations like taxation and property, even nationality and identity. Owen Lattimore. Modernity can also be understood as a system of enclosure, fueled and sustained by the destruction of self-sufficient lifeways, following their replacement with a system of economic exploitation, guided by states and orchestrated by policies, corporations, and the entire apparatus of domination. What then can we learn from the barbarians and the stateless people of the world? What lessons of freedom and evading direct confrontation? Let us ask the barbarians. Let us follow their ecologically viable trajectory. Life at the peripheries of much troubled and violent civilizations. The history of peoples without history is a history of their struggle against the state. Defined as Zomia by James C. Scott, is a vast region that virtually maps all the lands at altitudes above roughly 300 meters, all the way from the central highlands of Vietnam to northeastern India and traversing 5 Southeast Asian nations: Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Burma, and 4 provinces of China: Yunnan, Guizhou, Guangxi, and Sichuan, the art of not being governed. The region can be taken as an expanse of about 2.4 million sq.km, containing about 100 million peoples, often slotted as minorities, who in reality represent a truly bewildering ethnic and linguistic variety, according James C. Scott and earlier historians like Owen Lattimore, Eugene Burnouf, and Fernand Braudel. Zomia is not defined by enclosure, but the zones of contact and of refugee, when seen as a topographic view. Diverse environments that include not just the pastoral and non-sedentary, but also hunter-gatherers, nomads with domesticated animals, slash-and-burn farmers, traveling doctors, traders, weavers, masons, blacksmiths, medicine men, etc., etc. Dozens of intersecting or sometimes entirely isolated bands, spread all over Zomia, speak more than 10 languages and several related dialects. Among them are the Aka, Hmong, Karen, Lahu, Min, and Wa peoples. A nomadic periphery and adjacent states are the 2 principal spheres that these groups have navigated for well over 2,000 years. The autonomy has a direct relationship with survival, regardless of imposed national borders, internment camps and hundreds of attempts, violent and nonviolent, to civilize them over centuries. James C. Scott encapsulates such a geographic expanse as shatter zones or zones of refuge. For more than 2 millennia, at the peripheries of many empires, ancient and medieval, as well as nation-states of the modern era, the stateless have evolved, pursuing a diverse range of sustainable activities. Remarkable examples of survival and sustenance, ecological and social patterns within nomadism, that we find at higher altitudes, around deep jungles, seemingly arid harsh deserts, and while navigating riverways and myriad tributaries. A recent follow-up study Asterisk, 2018, reveals the nomad ability to evade and resist civilization. Stateless nature of various communities, about 45% of such non-sedentary, non-enclosure people, nomadic in terms of subsistence, do not exist for a given state in terms of birth records, address, passports, or legal ID. Berenice Belina, National University of Singapore. Further down the coastal regions South Asia, we find the nomadic sea peoples, or sea gypsies, Sama Bajo. Their nomadic seafaring cousins, numbering roughly 1.4 million, are the Moken, Burmese Thai Mergui Archipelago, the Orang Lot, southeastern Sumatra, Riau Islands of Indonesia and peripheries of Singapore, and the Tonka, southern China. Globally speaking, all identities without exception have been primarily social constructions, and for that very reason the above groups do not identify themselves as Chinese or Vietnamese or Indonesian or of any fixed nation-state in the region. To recount barbarian victory in medieval China, both the Yuan and Manchu/Qing dynasties were defeated by outlying Mongol tribes, Red Turban rebellions, and simultaneously bashed by natural disasters, mass flooding. The invading barbarians, backed by thousands of Buddhists, in turn would claim the center as the new elite of the sedentary state, living at the capital and operating the state apparatus, against the grain, James C. Scott. As the Chinese proverb has it, you can conquer a kingdom on horseback, but to rule it, you have to dismount. Zomia is probably the largest remaining region of the world whose peoples have not yet been fully incorporated into nation-states. In spite of several attempts to invade, capture, and convert these nomadic groups by Chiang Kai-shek, 1930s, followed by Mao/People's Liberation Army, 1950 to 1965, and later by Vietnam, Myanmar, Thailand, and Laos, the rebellious spirit or the fugitive status of all such people remains. However, the resilience is fledgling over time. A recent field study shows over 122,000 undocumented people crossed unmanned borders between South China, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and northeastern India. South China Morning Post, 2020. Yet, according to James C. Scott, their days are numbered. Not so very long ago, however, such self-governing peoples were the great majority of humankind. Today, we might identify them as our living ancestors, or the proverbial barbarian, or the savage Highlander. What human beings of the region were before they discovered wet rice cultivation, Buddhism, Hinduism, dynasties, and incoming civilization. Scott insists on the higher autonomy of non-sedentary people of the past as hill peoples, Zomia, are best understood as runaway, fugitive, maroon communities who have, over the course of 2 millennia, been fleeing the oppression of state-making projects. Yet the fugitive is not specific to South Asia, but can be found scattered around the entire world, whereby things like slavery, conscription, taxes, corvée labor, epidemics, and warfare would become synonymous of civilization making. Is sufficiently clear whichever way we might be oriented, in terms of escape or reform, that the people of Zomia are more autonomous and self-sufficient than those who were subjects of some empire or citizens of new nations, serving whatever political economy. Conceptually or as lived experience, evading the state and its grid-like emancipation of everything is encapsulated by historian and philosopher Arnold J. Toynbee as more directly, civilized life is symbolized by material abundance and complexity as much as the loss of social consciousness, the ability to escape disasters and every new crisis of modernity. Civilization on trial. In history, nomads/nomadism have always been regarded as a byproduct of the cultural evolution of sedentary farmers and a permanent threat. And that is a fundamental error, or say the civilized bias aimed at all outsiders, foreigners, non-natives, an outstanding fear of the non-enclosure, for non-broadal. Take the case of the Roman Empire and its relationship with the barbarians. Braudle's analysis of European civilization as a long process extending centuries emphasizes on the topography of continents and not so much on the popular buildings and core imaginaries of the past. Braudle insists that the invasive projects undertaken by organized armies was entirely dependent on the ability to find natural passage, build new roads, bridges, and carry water/food supplies over long distances. Actual conquest of barbarian lands and outlying regions was a never-ending project that stretched right down to modern era. Braudle's observation busted an inherent misunderstanding or false assessment of empires, framed within popular history, about the given empire's outreach on maps and words versus their actual dominion and ability to integrate and sustain power, material reality. For any empire, be it Greek, Roman, Spanish, or Portuguese, or even later, in order to extend dominion, the construction of roads and marine transport was fundamental, which enabled garrisons, further administration, cultivation, taxation, ports, towns, etc. Things that framed the center's relationship with the peripheries is key to understand the equity of any empire, as well as the autonomy of the barbarians. Why did the almighty Julius Caesar believe, "I'd rather be the first man in a barbarian village than the second man in Rome"? We may never know. The uncharted hinterlands and highlands outside core peripheries remained autonomous in their ability to adapt, whereby small bands invented ever new ways to evade the ill prospects of capture, slavery, forced labor, sedentary economics, written language, and the final inclusion into the empire. Decades ahead of the Roman Empire's apex, 115–120 CE, geographically diverse, outlying communities and non-sedentary groups had already been identified as extra societatum or outside civilized society. Pliny the Elder, 70 CE. This included every tribe or junta that came in contact with the expansion of the empire. New inquisitions followed standardization vis-a-vis institutionalization of territories, land tenure, customary laws, appointed chiefs, garrisons, even later as schools and paperwork, coalescing into a Roman identity. Yet the empire failed to actually convert so many barbarians, especially those who remained at the peripheries, however primitive, pagan, illiterate, warring, or unruly. The colonized and the converted barbarians, in turn, would attempt the conquest of the very state or empire, or worse, become a new ruling class by itself. Pliny's so-called primitives and adults who behave like children would eventually cause widespread disruption, raiding, invading, sacking, and weakening the might of the Roman Empire over centuries. Most notable amongst the dozens of so-called barbarians were the Picts, Caledonians, and Saxons in Britain, the Germanic tribes of Frisiae, Saxons, Franks, Alemanni, Burgundians, Marcomanni, Quadi, Ligii, Vandals, Juthungi, Gepids, and Goths. The Dacian tribes of the Carpi and the Sarmatian tribes of Iazyges, Roxolani and Alans, later Catalans, as well as Bastarni, Scythians, Barani, and Heruli along the Rhine-Danube rivers and the Black Sea. The following epoch, lasting almost 1,000 years, known as the Middle Ages, is witness to the mushrooming of hundreds of small autonomous juntas spread over the continent, an entanglement of barbarian and the civilized, the primitives and the enlightened, the free and the bound, the religious and the heretics, the people without history and the people with history. Organized religions that proliferated far and wide, including Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, attacked and demonized those who could not be captured or converted. Chastised, excluded, or abandoned, by the written word or by fables, we find thousands of verses, many divine verdicts upon the barbarians in many languages. Yet barbarians had also evolved to manifest their own supernatural gods and deities. Goddess Kali as an example. The deity and her lore was appropriated into medieval Hindu mythology and religious practices, yet the origins of Kali go a long way back to the dawn of humanity. A demon-slaying barbarian goddess, worshipped by the Neolithic Adivasis of Bengal. Kali statues found within nomad settlements dating back to the 2nd millennium BCE. But the story of expansionary states and self-governing peoples is not confined to Europe or Southeast Asia, nor the ancient/medieval worlds alone. Nor did the global barbarian fade into history as a symbol of primitive rebellion. It is echoed in the cultural and administrative process of internal colonialism that characterizes the formation of almost every modern Western nation-state, James C. Scott. Very clearly visible in the imperial projects of not just the ancient Chinese, Persian, Greek, or Roman, but also the House of Habsburgs, Spain, Austria, Holland, and Hungary, the Ottomans, medieval Anadolu, and the British, Russian, Japanese, right down to American expansionism in the 19th and 20th century. All these empires, their corresponding dynasties and nation-states, have waged continuous wars of inquisition in order to acquire higher dominion, as well as absorb every possible uncivilized spirit and body into myriad grids, historic segments of modernity. The matter of subjugation of indigenous peoples in white settler colonies such as the US, Canada, South Africa, Australia, Algeria, and even Palestine is a recurring conflict of autonomy and authority that has stretched over centuries and generations. The precise dynamics of the invader and the enslaved as encounters is unique to each case. The case with sedentary, town-dwelling Arabs and nomadic pastoralists of the Middle East, North and Sub-Saharan Africa has characterized much of Middle Eastern and Arab history. The sustained invasion, slavery, and conversion of the indigenous in the so-called New World is yet distinct as a form of hemispheric domination. Kill the Indian, save the man, and several other manifest destiny mantras that highlight the European invaders' quest to civilize or worse eliminate the barbarians and savage Indians. Roxanne Ortiz Dunbar. Vast numbers of nomads based in Africa merit a special mention in terms of their sheer ability to avoid Arab and European domination and slavery, as well as post-colonial African states. The nomadic Somali, Dinka, Nuer, Berbers, Afar, Bedouin, Tubu, Maasai, Fulani, Baran, Rendil, and Samburu, to name just a few. And two cheers for the 700-plus ethnic groups of India, commonly referred to as Adivasis, who still traverse in small bands across the entire subcontinent, often without cash, without passport or ID. The ubiquity of the encounter between self-governing and state-governed people can be understood in myriad ways, especially outside popular history and national sovereignty. As the raw and the cooked, the wild and the tamed, the hill/forest people versus the valley/cleared land people, upstream and downstream, the barbarian and the civilized, the backward and the modern, the people without history and the people with history, provides us with many possibilities for comparative triangulation. We shall take advantage of these opportunities where we can. The art of not being governed. Much like the ancient barbarians, the nomads of today, the stateless and undocumented people, tie up into one socio-ecological mode that is able to appear or disappear at any place and any time. One that is able to cope with rising scarcity and is also collapse-ready. The barbarian logic is perhaps something embedded in our social evolution, if not our DNA. Unlike the impositions of fixed identity, nationality, and a given profession, most often hogtied to modern means of production and corresponding modes of survival. Simply put, the barbarian logic is anarchy, anarchist frameworks, decisions, and actions that can fight back raw power. Perhaps even overthrow acquisition of land, avoid corporate slavery, enforced exploitation, taxation, and a range of negative impositions of the day. The ungovernable, escaping the tentacular state and its means of oppression, has been a popular aim for thousands of years and is even more prescient today, especially with the rise of ever worse forms of tyranny, wielded by the ruling class using a range of destructive laws, techniques, and technologies. The ungovernable is a response, however individual or based on kinship. History shows us all that some cultures developed sophisticated ways of living in hard-to-govern shatter zones. Some cultures rejected every offer and imposition of the so-called civilized and the modernized. May the true barbarian persist and motivate us all. So what is the correct response to the problem of power and totalitarian outreach of the state? What to do? Avoid it? Hide from it? Attack it? Ignore it? Or something else? Can we escape the state and live differently? If so, how? Alas, I don't know. But I do know how to become ungovernable. As a transformation, a transition to higher autonomy, whatever the consequences and yet not imagined outcomes. A return to barbarian logic. In case you wish to pledge support with a paid subscription, click here.